Officer James Chen drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his patrol car, his eyes scanning the empty streets of Pine Grove suburb. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:17 a.m., and the autumn night was unusually quiet. After 8 years on the force, he had learned that sometimes the quietest nights could turn into the most memorable ones. The streetlights cast long shadows across the closed storefronts of the local shopping center. Most of the businesses had shut down hours ago, their darkened windows reflecting the occasional flicker of his passing headlights. Chen was just about to turn onto Maple Street when something caught his attention. A man, dressed in dark clothing, was walking with an uneven pace near the abandoned Blockbuster building. In itself, that wasn't unusual. People worked late shifts, and some preferred walking home. But there was something off about the way this person moved. He would take a few quick steps, then slow down, his head constantly turning from side to side as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Chen slowed his patrol car, maintaining a distance that wouldn't immediately alert the suspicious individual. Through years of experience, he had developed what his colleagues called a sixth sense for trouble, and right now, that sense was screaming at him. The man's behavior didn't fit the typical pattern of a late-night worker or even a drunk person heading home after a long night at the bar. The officer noticed more details as he observed. Despite the cool weather, the man wasn't wearing a jacket. His clothes appeared expensive, what looked like dress pants and a button-down shirt, but they were wrinkled and dirty, as if he'd been wearing them for days. Every few steps, the man would reach up and adjust something on his wrist, a gesture that seemed almost compulsive. Chen radioed in his location to dispatch, keeping his voice low even though he was alone in the car. Unit 247, conducting a welfare check on a suspicious individual near the old Blockbuster on Commerce Street. Stand by. The crackling response came immediately. Copy that, Unit 247. Standing by. As Chen slowly pulled his car closer, the man's behavior became even more erratic. He would stop completely, then suddenly start walking again, his movements jerky and uncertain. The officer had seen similar behavior countless times, usually from people who were either under the influence or trying to avoid detection. But something about this situation felt different. The shopping center's security lights cast harsh shadows across the empty parking lot, creating pockets of darkness between the pools of yellow light. The man seemed to be deliberately staying in these shadows, moving from one dark spot to another like he was trying to avoid being seen. Chen noticed something else that set off warning bells in his mind. Despite the man's disheveled appearance, something glinted on his wrist every time he passed under a light, what appeared to be an expensive watch. The contrast between the high-end timepiece and the man's current state only added to the officer's suspicions. Making a decision, Chen flipped on his patrol car's lights but kept the siren off. The sudden burst of red and blue illumination cut through the darkness, causing the man to freeze in his tracks. His reaction was telling. Instead of the typical startled jump or quick attempt to run, the man simply stood still, his shoulders slumping as if in resignation. Chen pulled his car to a stop about 20 feet from the man, positioning it at an angle that would give him cover if needed. He quickly ran the plates of the few cars parked in the lot through his system, noting that none came back as stolen or flagged. Before stepping out of his vehicle, Chen took one more moment to observe. The man hadn't moved from his spot, but his right hand was now clenched in a tight fist at his side. His left hand kept moving to his wrist, adjusting that watch again and again. Dispatch, I'm going to make contact, Chen reported, his hand resting instinctively on his holstered weapon as he prepared to exit the vehicle. Copy that, Unit 247. Do you need backup on standby? Chen hesitated for a split second before responding. Negative at this time. Will advise if situation changes. As he opened his car door, Chen felt that familiar surge of adrenaline that came with every stop, every confrontation. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, a nagging feeling that this wasn't going to be a routine check. Whatever was about to happen would make this quiet night anything but ordinary. Officer Chen stepped out of his patrol car, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the man who still hadn't moved from his spot. As Chen approached, he noticed the man's expensive leather shoes were scuffed and covered in what appeared to be dried mud. Good evening, sir, Chen called out, maintaining a professional tone while keeping a safe distance. Everything all right tonight? The man's response was delayed, as if he needed time to process the simple question. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Yes, yes, officer. Just walking. Chen's trained eye caught more details as he drew closer. The man appeared to be in his mid-40s, with graying temples and what would normally be a well-groomed appearance. But his face was covered in a day's worth of stubble, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. His shirt, which Chen could now see was a high-end Brooks Brothers, had a small tear near the collar. "May I see some identification, please?" Chen requested, his flashlight beam lowered to avoid blinding the man but still providing enough light to see any sudden movements. The man's hand trembled as he reached for his back pocket. He fumbled with his wallet, nearly dropping it before managing to extract a driver's license. Chen noticed that the wallet was empty of cash, containing only a few credit cards. "Here," the man said, extending the license with an unsteady hand. Chen took the ID and examined it under his flashlight. David Morris, 46, from the wealthy Green Hills neighborhood about 20 miles away. The address and the man's disheveled appearance didn't add up. The photo showed a confident, well-groomed businessman, a stark contrast to the nervous wreck standing before him. "Mr. Morris, you're quite far from home," Chen observed, keeping his tone conversational. "Is your car nearby?" Morris's eyes darted to the nearly empty parking lot, then back to Chen. "No, I've been walking." "Walking?" Chen raised an eyebrow. "From Green Hills?" A bead of sweat rolled down Morris's temple despite the cool night air. His hand moved to his wrist again, adjusting that watch, a Rolex, Chen could now see, for what must have been the dozenth time. "Sir, are you sure everything's all right?" Chen pressed, noting how Morris's breathing had become more rapid. "If you're in some kind of trouble, I'm here to help." Morris opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. His eyes kept darting to something behind Chen, toward the industrial area behind the shopping center. The officer didn't turn to look, maintaining his focus on the increasingly agitated man before him. "Mr. Morris, let's start simple," Chen said, trying a different approach. "Why are you out here at this hour?" Morris's face contorted, as if he was fighting an internal battle. His knuckles were white from gripping his own wrist, and Chen noticed a small cut on his forearm, partially hidden by his sleeve. Morris started, then swallowed hard. His next words came out in a rush. "I should just go. I'm fine, really. Just got turned around, that's all." But as he tried to step away, his leg buckled slightly. Chen moved forward instinctively to steady him, and that's when he noticed something else, a faint, metallic smell coming from Morris's clothes, something that could have been blood. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay right here," Chen said, his voice firmer now. He reached for his radio, intending to call for backup, but Morris' next action stopped him cold. The businessman suddenly grabbed Chen's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there too, determination. "Officer," Morris whispered, his voice shaking but urgent. "I need to tell you something, but not here. They might be watching." Chen's hand moved closer to his weapon, but he didn't draw it. Years of experience told him this wasn't a threat. It was a cry for help. And whatever Morris was about to say next would change everything about this quiet night patrol. Officer Chen gently but firmly removed Morris's hand from his arm, maintaining a professional demeanor while sizing up the situation. The man's eyes were wide with panic, but there was an unmistakable urgency in his expression that Chen couldn't ignore. "Mr. Morris, if you're concerned about being watched, we can continue this conversation in my patrol car," Chen offered, gesturing toward the vehicle. "It's safe there." Morris shook his head frantically. "No, not the car. The lights. They'll see the lights." His voice dropped even lower. Just let me tell you 3 words. That's all you need to know." Chen's instincts were on high alert now. In his experience, people who were paranoid about being watched usually fell into 2 categories: those suffering from mental health issues and those who had legitimate reasons to be afraid. Something about Morris's expensive clothes, his Rolex watch, and his obvious education suggested the latter. "All right," Chen said calmly, positioning himself so he could see both Morris and the surrounding area. "What are these 3 words?" Morris glanced over his shoulder one more time, then leaned in close to Chen. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, and his whole body trembled. But when he spoke those 3 words, his voice was crystal clear. She needs help. The words hung in the night air for a moment before Morris continued, his voice breaking. I saw her. I saw them take her, and she's not the only one. Chen's training kicked in immediately. He reached for his radio, but Morris grabbed his arm again, this time with desperate strength. Wait, Morris hissed. There's more you need to know. They're armed, professional. I've been watching them for 3 days. That's why I look like this. I couldn't go home. Couldn't risk leading them there. My wife, my daughters. Chen could see the genuine fear in Morris's eyes. This wasn't the ranting of a disturbed person. This was someone who had witnessed something terrible and had been carrying the weight of that knowledge. How many? Chen asked quietly, his hand still on his radio. 5 that I've seen. Maybe more, Morris replied, finally releasing Chen's arm. They're using the old warehouse behind the shopping center, the one that used to be a distribution center. I work in the office building next door. 3 days ago, I was working late, saw something through my window I wasn't supposed to see. Chen nodded, processing the information. The warehouse Morris mentioned had been empty for months, but there had been recent reports of suspicious vehicles in the area. Nothing concrete enough to warrant investigation, but now... The women, Morris continued, his voice cracking. They'd bring them in at night. I've seen 3 so far. Young? Scared. The last one, she couldn't have been more than 20. He touched his watch again, but this time Chen realized it wasn't a nervous tick. He was checking the time, keeping track of something. They move them every 4 days, Morris explained, seeing Chen's questioning look. Tonight's the 4th night. That's why I'm here. I couldn't just... Chen made his decision. He reached for his radio, keeping his voice low and steady. Dispatch, this is Unit 247. I need immediate backup at my location. Silent approach. Possible 207 in progress. Multiple suspects, possibly armed. The response was immediate. Copy that. Unit 247. All available units responding. Hold your position. Morris sagged with relief, as if a huge burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Thank God, he whispered. I've been trying to figure out how to report this without putting my family at risk. These people, they're organized, professional. I was afraid if I just walked into a police station. Chen understood. In cases like this, caution wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Mr. Morris, I need you to tell me everything you've seen. Every detail matters now. But first, we're going to move somewhere safer. As Chen carefully guided Morris toward a more secure position behind the patrol car, he could already hear the distant sound of sirens being cut. Backup approaching silently. The quiet night was about to become anything but, and whatever was happening in that warehouse was about to be exposed. Morris looked at his watch one final time. They usually move them at 3 a.m., he said. We have less than 20 minutes. Within minutes, 4 police cars had silently surrounded the area, their lights off as they positioned themselves strategically around the shopping center. Officer Chen and Morris crouched behind the patrol car, while Chen briefed the newly arrived officers in hushed tones. According to our witness, Chen whispered, gesturing to Morris, there are at least 5 armed suspects inside the warehouse. They're holding multiple women against their will, and they're planning to move them within the next 15 minutes. Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran officer with 20 years of experience in tactical operations, nodded grimly. Mr. Morris, we need to know exactly where they're keeping the victims. Any details about the layout inside? Morris pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, his hand steadier now that help had arrived. On it was a rough sketch of the warehouse interior, drawn from his observations over the past 3 days. There's a main entrance here, he pointed, but they don't use it. They have a loading dock on the east side, hidden from the street. The women are kept in what used to be the old office space, here in the northwest corner. I've seen them post guards at these 2 points. The officers studied the makeshift map intently. Rodriguez turned to Chen. SWAT's 10 minutes out. We need to make sure they don't move those women before backup arrives. Suddenly, Morris grabbed Chen's arm. Look, he whispered, pointing toward the warehouse. A dim light had flickered on inside, barely visible through the dirty windows. The officers watched as a white van slowly pulled around the back of the building, its headlights off. The vehicle moved with practiced precision, backing up to the loading dock with barely a sound. "That's them," Morris said, his voice tight. "That's the van they use. I've seen it before." Rodriguez made a quick decision. "We can't wait for SWAT. If they start moving the victims now, we need to act." He turned to his team. "Johnson, take your unit around the back. Peters, cover the east exit. Chen, you and Williams approach from the west. The rest of you, form a perimeter. Nobody gets in or out." As the officers moved into position, Morris caught Chen's sleeve. "Officer, there's something else you need to know." He hesitated, then continued. "One of the women, I heard them talking. She's the daughter of a state judge. That's why they've been so careful. They're planning to use her for blackmail." This new information sent a fresh wave of urgency through the team. If they were dealing with a politically motivated kidnapping on top of human trafficking, the situation was even more volatile than they thought. "All units in position," crackled the radio, barely above a whisper. Rodriguez gave final instructions. "Remember, our priority is the safety of the victims. We need to move fast but smart. Watch your crossfire and be ready for anything." Chen checked his weapon one last time, his heart pounding but his hands steady. Through the warehouse windows, shadows moved against the dim light, indicating movement inside. "Mr. Morris," Chen said quietly, "you've done your part. Stay here behind the patrol car. You'll be safe here." Morris nodded, his face pale but determined. "Just get them out. Please." The radio crackled again. Movement at the loading dock. 2 males armed. They're opening the van doors. Rodriguez's voice was steel. "All units, prepare to move on my mark. The second they start bringing out the victims, we go. Remember your training. These subjects are armed and dangerous." Chen positioned himself behind a concrete pillar, his body tense and ready. The night air was thick with anticipation as the officers waited for Rodriguez's signal. Inside the warehouse, more lights came on. The shadows moved with purpose now, and through the grimy windows, Chen could make out figures moving toward the office area where the victims were allegedly held. "This is it," Rodriguez whispered into the radio. "Stand by." Morris, still crouched behind the patrol car, checked his watch one final time. It was 2:57 a.m. Whatever was about to happen would change lives forever, both for the victims inside and for him. 3 days of secret observation, of carrying this terrible knowledge alone, were about to end in what he prayed would be a rescue rather than a tragedy. The warehouse door began to open. The warehouse door creaked open, and 2 men emerged, their movements confident and practiced. They were dressed in dark clothing, with baseball caps pulled low over their faces. Each carried a handgun, held casually but ready at their sides. Chen watched from his position as the men scanned the area, completely unaware of the police officers surrounding them. His finger rested lightly on his weapon's trigger guard, waiting for Rodriguez's signal. "Team 1, report any visual on the victims," Rodriguez whispered through the radio. "Negative," came the response. "Wait. Movement inside. They're bringing someone toward the loading dock." Through the warehouse's open door, Chen could see a third man leading a young woman. Her hands were bound in front of her, and even from a distance, the fear on her face was evident. She had long dark hair and was wearing what looked like expensive clothes, though they were wrinkled and dirty. "That's the judge's daughter," Morris whispered from behind the patrol car, his voice barely audible. "Sarah Mitchell." A fourth man appeared behind them, leading another woman. This one was younger, possibly in her early 20s, with blonde hair. She stumbled as they walked, and the man roughly grabbed her arm to keep her upright. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, tense but controlled. "All units, prepare to move. On my mark." But before he could give the signal, something unexpected happened. One of the women, Sarah, suddenly jerked away from her captor. Perhaps she had seen movement in the darkness, or maybe desperation had finally overcome her fear. She threw her bound hands up, catching the man in the face. "Now," Rodriguez's voice cracked through the radio like a whip. Everything happened at once. The police officers emerged from their positions, weapons drawn, flashlights suddenly illuminating the loading dock area like daylight. "Police! Drop your weapons! On the ground now!" The traffickers reacted with professional speed, but they were caught completely off guard. One tried to grab Sarah, but she was already running, stumbling in the darkness. Chen broke from his position, racing toward her as gunfire erupted behind him. "Get down," he shouted, reaching her just as one of the traffickers raised his weapon. Chen tackled her to the ground as bullets whizzed overhead. The air filled with shouts and the sound of gunfire. From his position on the ground, Chen could see Officer Williams taking down one of the men while Rodriguez and his team engaged the others. "Stay down," Chen told Sarah, quickly cutting her bonds with his pocket knife. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded, pressing herself flat against the pavement. More police cars arrived, their sirens now blaring, filling the night with red and blue light. The firefight was brief but intense. 2 of the traffickers were down, wounded but alive. Another had surrendered immediately, dropping his weapon and falling to his knees with his hands raised. But the 4th man had managed to slip back inside the warehouse, dragging the blonde woman with him as a shield. Subject barricaded inside. Rodriguez's voice boomed over the radio. "He's got a hostage." Chen looked at Sarah, who was shaking but alert. "Are there more women inside?" She nodded. "One more. In the office, and there's another man guarding her." SWAT arrived at that moment, their heavy vehicle rumbling into position. The team deployed quickly, taking up positions around the warehouse as a negotiator began attempting contact with the barricaded suspect. Chen helped Sarah to her feet and guided her toward the safety of the police line, where paramedics were waiting. As they moved, she grabbed his arm. "Officer," she said, her voice hoarse but urgent, "the man inside, the one with Lisa, he's the leader. He has information on his phone about other girls, other locations. You can't let him destroy it." Rodriguez overheard and immediately relayed this information to the SWAT team. The situation had just become even more critical. Not only did they need to rescue the remaining hostages, but they also needed to secure evidence that could lead to an even larger trafficking operation. As the SWAT team prepared to breach, Chen got Sarah safely to the paramedics. The night wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. 2 women were still inside, and their captors were cornered and desperate. And somewhere in that warehouse was evidence that could help bring down an entire human trafficking network. The SWAT team moved into position around the warehouse with practiced precision. Their commander, Captain Torres, quickly assessed the situation while the negotiator continued attempts to contact the suspects inside. "This is the police. We have the building surrounded. Release the hostages and come out with your hands up." The negotiator's voice boomed through the megaphone, echoing in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside, they could hear movement and muffled voices. Sarah, still being treated by paramedics, provided crucial information to the officers. "The man in there, Marcus Wheeler, he's not going to surrender," she told Chen, her voice steadier now. "He has connections in high places. That's why he wasn't afraid to kidnap a judge's daughter." Chen relayed this information to Captain Torres, who nodded grimly. "We need to breach, but we have to be smart about this. 2 hostages, 2 suspects, and vital evidence we can't let them destroy." Suddenly, Wheeler's voice rang out from inside. "I want a car. You get us a car with a clear path to the highway, or these girls die." The negotiator started to respond, but was cut off by a scream from inside. The blonde hostage's voice pierced the night air, followed by the sound of something heavy falling. Captain Torres made an instant decision. "That's it. We're going in. Alpha Team, take the main entrance. Bravo Team, loading dock. Charlie Team, roof access. Move." The SWAT teams burst into action. Flashbangs exploded through the windows, filling the warehouse with blinding light and deafening noise. The breach was simultaneous from all 3 points, creating chaos and confusion for those inside. "Police, drop your weapons." "On the ground, now." The commands echoed through the warehouse as SWAT members moved in tactical formation through the space. Through his radio, Chen could hear the progress of the operation. "First suspect down, loading dock secure. Moving to office area, cover right." Then came the sound of more gunfire, sharp, quick bursts that made everyone outside tense. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Shots fired. 1 suspect down. Medical needed. Hostages secured. I repeat, hostages secured. Chen watched as medical teams rushed forward, ready to enter once SWAT gave the all-clear. Morris, who had remained behind the patrol car throughout the operation, stood up slowly, his face showing both relief and disbelief at how quickly everything had happened. The blonde hostage emerged first, supported by 2 SWAT officers. Despite a cut on her forehead, she was walking on her own. Behind her, medical teams brought out the 3rd victim on a stretcher. She was conscious but appeared to have been beaten. Wheeler was brought out last, handcuffed and bleeding from a shoulder wound. His face showed no fear, only a cold anger as officers led him to a waiting police car. 1 SWAT officer followed, holding a sealed evidence bag containing Wheeler's phone and laptop. "Building is clear," came the final call. "Scene secure." As the situation stabilized, Chen approached the SWAT commander. "What happened in there?" Captain Tars removed his tactical helmet, wiping sweat from his forehead. Wheeler tried to make a break for it, using the blonde girl as a shield. His partner panicked, started shooting. "Nearly hit Wheeler instead of us." He shook his head. "Amateur move." Wheeler shot his own man in response, but our team had already flanked him. Took him down clean. The scene quickly transformed into a hive of activity. Crime scene investigators arrived. Emergency medical teams treated the victims and wounded suspects, and detectives began collecting preliminary statements. Sarah, now wrapped in a blanket and reunited with her father, who had rushed to the scene, approached Chen and Morris. "Thank you," she said simply, looking at Morris. "The other girls told me someone had been watching the warehouse. They saw you through the windows. You gave us hope." Morris, exhausted and emotional, could only nod. Chen placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. As the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, Rodriguez approached with news. "Just got word from the tech team. Wheeler's phone is a Goldman. Contact lists, locations, financial records. Looks like we've stumbled onto something big here. This could bring down trafficking operations in 3 states." Chen looked at the warehouse, now brilliantly lit by police lights and crime scene equipment. What had started as a simple suspicious person stop had turned into something much larger. As he watched Wheeler being driven away in a police car, he knew this case was far from over. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as the full scope of Wheeler's trafficking operation came to light. The evidence from his phone and laptop had opened a Pandora's box of criminal activity that spread far beyond their small suburban jurisdiction. In the station's largest conference room, now converted into a command center, Chen watched as FBI agents pinned photos and documents to evidence boards that covered every wall. Wheeler's operation had tentacles reaching into multiple states, involving corrupt officials, fake transportation companies, and offshore bank accounts. Officer Chen called Special Agent Diana Martinez, who was leading the federal investigation. "We need to go over your initial contact with David Morris again. Every detail matters now." Chen described that crucial night encounter for what felt like the 100th time, but he understood the importance. Morris's decision to seek help had turned out to be the thread that, when pulled, began unraveling a massive criminal enterprise. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell had proven to be a key witness. Despite her traumatic experience, she had maintained her composure and provided detailed testimony about her time in captivity. Her father, Judge Mitchell, had taken a leave of absence from the bench to support her through the process. Wheeler made a mistake targeting the judge's daughter, Martinez explained during a briefing. He thought it would give him leverage, but it just put him on more radars. "We've been watching several of these operations for months, but could never get enough evidence for a warrant." The investigation revealed that Wheeler's organization had trafficked dozens of women over the past 2 years. They had used the seemingly abandoned warehouse as just one of several temporary holding locations across the state. Morris, who had been placed under protective custody along with his family, continued to assist the investigation. His detailed observations from those 3 days of watching the warehouse proved invaluable in corroborating other evidence. "I never imagined it would lead to all this," Morris told Chen during a protected meeting at a safe house. "I just couldn't walk away when I saw what was happening. My daughters are the same age as some of those women." The rescue victims were receiving support and care at a specialized facility. The blonde woman, identified as Lisa Thompson, had been reported missing from a neighboring state 3 weeks earlier. The 3rd victim, Maria Sanchez, was reuniting with family who had been searching for her for over a month. One afternoon, Chen received an unexpected call from Rodriguez. "You need to see this," his sergeant said, leading him to an interrogation room where Wheeler was being held. Through the one-way glass, they watched as Wheeler sat across from federal prosecutors. His confident demeanor had finally cracked after days of isolation and mounting evidence. "He's rolling over on his partners," Rodriguez explained. "Names, dates, locations, everything. Turns out there's honor among thieves, but only until someone's looking at 3 life sentences." Wheeler's confession led to a series of coordinated raids across 3 states. More victims were rescued, more traffickers arrested, and more evidence collected. The case was becoming one of the largest trafficking busts in the state's history. Sarah Mitchell made a surprise visit to the station 1 week after her rescue. She looked different now, stronger, determined. She asked to speak with Chen privately. "I wanted you to know," she said, sitting in the break room with a cup of coffee. "I'm starting a foundation to help other survivors, to raise awareness about trafficking. Dad's helping me set it up." Chen nodded, noticing how her hands no longer shook when she held her cup. "That's amazing. You're turning something terrible into something positive." "It's because of people like you and Mr. Morris," she replied. "People who don't look away when they see something wrong, who take action even when it's dangerous." As Sarah left the station, Chen reflected on how a single decision, his choice to stop and check on a suspicious person, Morris's choice to seek help instead of looking away, had created a ripple effect that would impact countless lives. The investigation was far from over, but already it had exposed profound failures in the system and opportunities for change. New protocols were being developed, task forces formed, and resources allocated to prevent similar operations from taking root. That night, as Chen drove past the warehouse during his patrol, he noticed it was no longer dark and abandoned. Crime scene tape still surrounded it, and lights blazed from every window as investigators continued their meticulous work. What had once been a place of darkness had become a beacon of hope for change. 6 months after that fateful night, Officer Chen sat in the courthouse, watching as Marcus Wheeler and his associates faced sentencing. The trial had drawn national attention, exposing the dark underbelly of human trafficking networks that operated in plain sight. Wheeler, once proud and defiant, now sat slumped in his chair as the judge read out his sentence. 3 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. His confession had implicated dozens of conspirators, including 2 corrupt police officers and a city council member, all of whom would face their own days in court. After the sentencing, Chen met David Morris in the courthouse lobby. The accountant looked remarkably different from that nervous man Chen had encountered in the shopping center parking lot. Morris had received a civilian commendation for his role in breaking the case, though he remained modest about his contribution. "I still have trouble sleeping sometimes," Morris admitted, adjusting his tie, a new nervous habit that had replaced his old watch checking. "But my therapist says that's normal. The important thing is that those women are safe, and this can't happen to anyone else in that warehouse." The warehouse itself had been transformed. Sarah Mitchell's foundation had purchased the property, and renovations were underway to convert it into a support center for trafficking survivors. The loading dock where the confrontation had taken place would become a welcome center, a symbol of hope rather than fear. Later that day, Chen attended a ceremony at police headquarters. The department was implementing new training protocols based on the case, teaching officers to better recognize signs of trafficking. Chen's initial interaction with Morris was being used as a case study in how to approach and handle suspicious situations. Officer Chen's instincts and approach that night exemplified the best qualities of law enforcement, Chief Williams announced to the assembled officers and press. He demonstrated that sometimes the most important police work happens not in dramatic raids, but in simply taking the time to investigate something that doesn't feel right. The aftermath of the case had rippled far beyond their jurisdiction. State legislators were working on new laws to combat trafficking, while federal agencies had established a task force specifically dedicated to investigating similar operations. Lisa Thompson and Maria Sanchez had both become advocates, sharing their stories to help others recognize trafficking signs. They occasionally spoke at police training sessions, helping officers understand the victim's perspective. "You know what I remember most about that night?" Lisa told Chen after one such session. "Not the fear, not the gunfire, but the moment I saw all those police lights. For the first time in weeks, I knew I wasn't invisible anymore. Sarah Mitchell's foundation had already helped dozens of survivors rebuild their lives. She had turned her trauma into purpose, working tirelessly to ensure other women wouldn't face what she had endured. The foundation's first fundraising gala raised over $2 million for survivor support services. As Chen drove home that evening, he passed the old shopping center where it had all begun. The area had changed. New businesses had moved in, better lighting had been installed, and community watch programs had been established. But he never drove past without remembering that night, that nervous man adjusting his watch, those 3 words that had changed everything. She needs help. Morris had retired from his accounting firm, choosing instead to work with Sarah's foundation as a financial advisor. His family had moved to a new home, but he still kept in touch with Chen, meeting occasionally for coffee to discuss the ongoing impact of the case. The final piece of the investigation fell into place when Wheeler's international contacts were exposed, leading to trafficking ring busts in 3 other countries. The evidence from his phone had created a domino effect that was still toppling criminal enterprises months later. At the end of his shift, Chen parked near the renovated warehouse, now nearly ready to open as the New Beginnings Support Center. The building's dark past had been literally painted over with bright colors and hopeful messages. Where there had once been security cameras to guard illegal activities, there were now sunflowers growing in garden boxes. A plaque near the entrance read, "Freedom begins with someone caring enough to act." Below it, in smaller letters, were the words that had started it all: "She needs help." Chen smiled, thinking about how a simple patrol stop had led to all this. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest actions: a suspicious feeling, a decision to stop, 3 words spoken in the dark.